Good morning. Thanks to everyone for coming out so early. I'm Tom Maloney. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics and the director of the Tanner Human Rights Center. I want to welcome you to our conference on building peace in the 21st century. This is a collaboration in part with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, their global ethics network. And sort of the idea is to think about 2014 as the centennial of the founding of the Carnegie Council, also the centennial of the start of World War I, and to think about coming threats to peace, important threats to peace in the present day and in the coming century. Three speakers from the Carnegie Council are sort of framing the discussion for us, beginning last night with Jean-Marc Coicot, who spoke about moving beyond the culture of fear and insecurity. This afternoon, we will have David Roden speaking down at the law school on just war theory. And our last panel this afternoon, led by Cheney Ryan and a number of students from the University of Utah and other local universities, speaking on pragmatism and vision in building peace. And so those are all kind of big picture considerations. And then in between, beginning this morning, we'll be taking up very particular threats to peace in the coming century. We'll talk about economic inequality as a threat to peace, terroristic violence or violence by non-state actors, and then beginning this morning with a consideration of environmental degradation as a threat to peace. And so I want to welcome Michelle Strobel from the S.J. Quinney College of Law, who will lead our first panel. Michelle.
So good morning, everyone. And since I'm a facilitator, I always have to start with something ground ruly. So I'm sure everybody's turned their cell phone to something silent. Thank you very much. So we have three speakers, and they're actually going to be sitting out here so they can watch each other's presentations, and then we'll come sit up here when it's question and answer time. And I'll introduce each speaker as they're going to start. First one is Professor Tariq Benouri. He's a lecturer in the City and Metropolitan Planning Department here at the U, and also an adjunct professor in the Economics Department. He's editor of Development, a journal of the Society for International Development, and he's a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Please welcome Professor Benouri.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What does it say? Security alert. Oh, my goodness. Fear and security. Very sorry to get you up so early in the morning. Very sorry to get me up so early in the morning. But let's get this thing started. One of the challenges that we face today is, I think Abraham Lincoln's words at the House Divided speech are great. He said, if we could first know where we are and whether we are tending, we could then judge better what to do and how to do it. And let's take a look at where we are and whether we are tending. The wonderful historian J.R. McNeill had a recent book, well, not that recent, about 10 years ago, Something New Under the Sun. And he had a number of things, and I thought I should just put them down more or less verbatim. More or less because, you have to fit it into the screen, so I've taken some words out and added some words, as you will see later. He said, communism aspired to become the universal creed of the 20th century, but it failed, and a more flexible and seductive religion succeeded instead. The religion was the quest for economic growth. Capitalists, nationalists, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, LDS, you can see I have added a few things here. Hindus, Buddhists, as well as communists worshipped at the same altar, the quest for economic growth. Growth has disguised a multitude of sins: corruption, surveillance states, global and national inequities, terror, despotism. Indeed, adherents to the faith proposed that only growth could resolve these ills. The growth religion, on balance, was quite useful in an empty world. These are Herman Daly's words. But today it has created a crowded and stressed one, and shows no inclination to adapt to the change. Yet it is an iron law of nature that if humans do not choose wisely, nature will choose efficiently and ruthlessly. This, I believe, is a dilemma that we face, the dilemma between all the things that growth has done for us and now the challenge that we face. He gives a number of examples. One can say people have lived with corruption, people have lived with surveillance states, rights abuses, single-party rule, global inequalities. Thomas Friedman says we shouldn't worry about inequality because tomorrow the world will be flat. Rising inequality, the OECD countries consistently, every single country has produced massive increases in inequality, including the so-called equal ones, the Scandinavian countries. Growth has hidden a multitude of sins, but its time has gone. Today we are confronted by a number of limits which tell us that this process of endless growth upon which we based our society, our economy, our polity, our culture, has come to an end. This cannot be with us any longer. We have seen the limits to growth from 1972. The Meadows' wonderful contribution to our thinking. Planetary boundaries, Johan Rockström and others writing about 5 years ago, in which they brought in some of the biological and biodiversity elements. But the worst, the most dangerous of all, is climate change. Let me get to it, but mention one other thing. If you think about the world as about 4.6 billion years old, and you scale it to 46 years, 4.6 to 46, then we, humans, have been here for 4 hours. That means in year 46, December 31, 8 p.m. is when we arrive on the planet. Our industrial revolution began 1 minute ago, 11:59, and on year 46, on December 31. And in that 1 minute, we have destroyed 50% of the nature's forests. We have literally devastated the earth in that 1 minute that we have had the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution has been a very useful thing for us because we suddenly achieved, we suddenly got this bonanza of energy which was sitting underground unused. Before that, all that we had, and let me show you something. Before that, all that we had, if you look at the diagram, before that, all that we had was muscle and firewood, muscle and firewood. That was the source of energy. That was what we based our society on. That's what we based our economy on. Our muscle, the horses, the elephants, the camels, and firewood. That's what we had. And then we suddenly found this huge hordes of free energy, pretty much, and we've been using it. 1 gallon of petrol has the energy equivalent to somebody working for us for 3 months. You can drive to Park City from here and use up 3 months of somebody's time without thinking about it. It costs us about less than $4. 1 barrel of petrol on which we debate is equal to 10 years of labor, 10 years of human labor. Now, this all of a sudden, this energy bonanza has completely transformed the world, and it has added a phenomenal number of benefits, advantages, etc. But the most important thing it has done is to give us this illusion of permanent and unending growth. And it is this illusion on the basis of which we have, in some sense, been able to build a little bit more humane world. Now, the problem is that climate change is already here. This is not something in the future. We thought that it was going to take some time, but it is already here. Here are some of the crises, the disasters that we know have been happening already, and you can see that the curve building up from 1980s onwards. Climate change is already here. I just wanted to show you this diagram just to sort of give an idea of the crisis. In the IPCC second assessment report, when the diagram was built, when I started working with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, at that time we knew that climate change was happening, but we didn't know what was dangerous. And when you sort of sat in and people had no idea about, where is the limit, if anything. And at that time, people were only talking about carbon doubling, because somehow or the other you need some number, and doubling is kind of a normal number. So carbon doubling from pre-industrial to post-industrial, to the current period, we are thinking about 550, 570 as kind of the limit. And then this diagram, which was done to show the impacts of climate change. And the colors are indicative because the yellow is 66% confidence, and orange is 95%, and red is 99% confidence. Our dear friend John Schellenhuber, the head of the Potsdam Climate Institute, he said, well, look, at about 2 degrees, everything seems to be turning from orange to red. So in some sense, you can say that that is a place where we are very confident that it is dangerous. We should not go beyond 2 degrees. Hence, this idea of 2 degrees came up. It's not really a kind of a scientific thing, but it's something which you can look at this diagram and it comes through. This is the diagram of the 4th assessment report, not even the 5th assessment report. Essentially, by the 4th assessment report, and certainly now the 5th assessment report, we know that this is too dangerous. 2 degrees is too dangerous. 2 degrees, you had a 2 in 3 chance of the Earth getting destroyed. That's like playing Russian roulette with 2 bullets in the chamber. Well, now we are down to about 5.5 bullets in the chamber. Climate change is upon us. Climate change is speeding very fast. And the one thing about climate change, unlike all the other environmental limits, is the following: that climate change makes the only thing which has helped us deal with other limits, makes it a problem. And that thing is energy. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I showed you this diagram, because what it shows is that we are at a point where we'll have to have some kind of major transformation in our energy systems. Otherwise, we will not survive. So when I was at the UN, the United Nations General Assembly asked for a report on climate change and security, and we did a report which I recommend very strongly to you, the United Nations Secretary General's report on climate change and security implications of climate change. And one of the things that we said is that all of these disasters seems to be coming at our way. What climate change is going to do as far as security is, and we use one of the words that's current in the literature, it is a threat multiplier. All the other threats, the threats that exist normally, the threat of war, the threat of human security, it multiplies those threats. And essentially what we did is we looked at different dimensions through which climate change would make its impact. Resource scarcity or resource abundance, both of them cause problems, right? If the North Sea lanes open, there will be a scramble for it. If the ices melt, there'll be a scramble for that land. And resource scarcity, as water dries up, it will create some fight. Statelessness, the Maldives example. On the left, vulnerable populations affected by health and other problems. And of course, development itself will be slowed down because of the increasing cost and scarcity of energy. And our concern is that uncoordinated actions in each of these will lead to increased conflict. If it is possible for more coordinated, more considerate actions, it will reduce conflict. And in some sense, we said there are threat minimizers, and there is a word that we know already for all of the things that we proposed in threat minimizers, and that word is sustainable development. And we put some of those things in. Now, I just want to go on from that point and to raise 2 or 3 specific elements for this. One is that let's go back to climate change a bit and just say that we have known about climate change for about 20, 25 years now. And God knows, we have tried to do something about it. There is a whole process starting from 1992 with the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, 1997, Kyoto Protocol, 2007, the Bali Package, 2009, the Copenhagen disaster, and now, of course, Warsaw. We started off with grand motives because, in some sense, at that time, we didn't really believe it was that rapid. And so if you look at the 1992, there was a lot of stress on equity, on common but differentiated responsibilities, on polluters pay principles, on the right to development. There was a number of those issues, the framing issues that set in, this is how we will solve the problem. By 1997, as the problem became a little bit more urgent, they were gone. And all we had was voluntary actions. There's no mention of the word equity in the Kyoto Protocol, and resort to purely market-based solutions. 2007, as the urgency becomes even more sort of visible, I think our response was to say, can we actually undo some of the equity considerations because we can't deal with them? So there was an attempt to roll back the common but differentiated responsibilities, but it survived in some fashion. 2009, there was for the first time some money on the table as one of the representatives of equity, but again, it has taken a long time coming. Now there are other issues here in Warsaw, the loss and damage and the Green Climate Fund. But, in some sense, we are seeing two distinct trends. One is that the rich countries are behaving like the gentleman on the left side. They are having a quiet desperation moment of their own, and it's not possible for them to do anything. And the second trend that we see is, well, nobody asking you to do anything. Let's just all say that we are going to somewhere, and we'll see who gets there. And so a focus on voluntary actions and saying that we will not bear the responsibility. We haven't sort of been able to think of many new things, partly because we've been waiting. Now, the one question that we need to ask here is about growth. Now, as I mentioned, start with J.R. McNeill, growth has solved a multitude of sins. It has hidden a multitude of sins. But how necessary it is. And so right now you have a lot of discussion going on. The bottom line of this is this diagram, which says up to a certain point, growth does produce some positive impact. It reduces poverty. It reduces sort of the effects on because of scarcity and human indignity and so forth. But beyond that, it's nothing. It's just wastage. And the crossing line is somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. Francis Stewart will tell us that it's $10,000. I believe it's a little bit higher than that, but that's somewhere in that. The world globally is already at $10,000 per capita. If this could be divided equally, I think we would be much better shape. But the thing is that as far as our quality of life of people in this country or similar countries is concerned, growth isn't going to get us anything. It might get us a few more VCRs, but not get us a better quality of life. There are relatedly other things also, that much of the discussions has focused simply on climate and not on the overall, how do you solve the problem? And so it basically says, let's cut down on greenhouse gases without thinking of anything else. And at least some of the people who are commenting on this are saying, well, let's look at something else. Let's look at energy, for instance. This diagram is an interesting diagram. This is one of the later ones from the Potsdam Climate Institute, Weinshausen and others. All that it shows is, thank you, I think I'm in good shape. All that it shows is that we know that the impact on climate depends upon our long-term emissions, 40 years emissions. So for 40 years, we have a budget of greenhouse gas emissions, and we can basically decide whether we want to get there quicker, the green line that we start early and then we gradually taper out, or the red line that we delay action as far as possible and then slash it down. Now, the problem with this is that it basically shows that there's a fixed amount of carbon budget available, and either you can have it or I can have it. Now, if I know that, I will fight to have the most of it, and you will fight to have the most of it, and that's pretty much what's going on in the carbon debates. All the countries are basically trying to say, how can we get more of this budget? The question we would ask is, well, behind it is our energy consumption. If we drew the same diagram, instead of showing carbon, the emissions on the vertical axis, if we showed energy, we would get pretty much the same diagram. But if we had energy on the vertical axis, we would not ask how to cut that budget. We would ask how to move this curve up. How do we get more energy without emissions? That's kind of the challenge. And that can bring about a major transformation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason I'm saying all this is that there is a kind of a head-on clash between growth and the limits that we now confront, climate change being the most urgent one. One way of doing it is to say, can we cut back on growth? Another way of doing that is to say, can we have it a little bit longer through some other ways? And a third way of this, can we hide our head in the sand? Now, this is pretty much takes us back to the debates. Sorry, this is in the wrong order, but the next slide will. This pretty much takes us back to the different components are really talking about different ways of addressing the issue of social justice. And if you look at the debates or discussions that are going on, more or less they represent it. And since I don't have time, I don't want to go into this in detail, but there are essentially these kind of three elements. One is that social justice is necessary for peace. That goes back to Kant's quest for perpetual peace, and he talked about the ways in which war can be avoided and a permanent peace can be established, and social justice for him was very central to this. Second is that it is also a basis for prosperity. In fact, Hobbes earlier on had even said this already, that it is justice that can actually create a basis for a lack of war. But Hobbes also gave us an indication that continued prosperity did depend upon a basis in social justice, and that's something that has continued elsewhere. Thomas Malthus is represented by people to talk about nature. He was not talking about nature. He was really talking against social justice. I'll give you a couple of slides, and then we'll go on. I'm going to skip over this. This is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. We have a number of solutions proposed for climate and the growth challenge. Some of them are what we call the neo-Kantian solutions. Some I call the neo-Hobbesians and the neo-Malthusians. And this is how the structure is. They're all based on a certain degree of optimism. Some think that technology will solve us. Some think that the market will solve us. Some think that we are good people and we will solve our problems. And some think that our politicians are wonderful people and they will solve the problem. You decide. The technology one, the neo-Kantian ones, the energy transformation I've already mentioned. It is a way of actually getting the poor up to the level that we need before we cut down. The neo-Hobbesian ones, which says we need to have continued growth, are focusing on things like geoengineering and nuclear renaissance. The neo-Malthusians, I've already said, are denialism. And then you have loss and damage, carbon tax, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read you this. It's a wonderful quote. But Thomas Malthus minced no words. His main purpose was that if you give the poor more, they will destroy the world, keep them down. That is what his intention was. So, what to do? My last point. The problem is, we now confront the limits. We don't confront them at individual levels. We confront them for the planet as a whole. We live in a single house. And like a house that the gentleman earlier talked about, this too cannot stand divided unto itself, half free and half enslaved by poverty. In this house, justice has come to be defined via the quest for growth. For 200 years, that is what we have done. We have defined justice in terms of economic growth. Flat land. You are poor, but tomorrow you will be rich. But in future, it cannot be defined by the quest for growth any longer. It will be defined by the need to live within our means. The challenge for us is not merely to solve the climate problem or to solve the growth problem, but to build the basis of a decent and peaceful society. And throughout history, building the basis of a decent and prosperous society and peaceful society, there has been only one solution. More than 2,000 years, Heraclitus uttered these wonderful words. He said, "Justice is the strife. Justice is the only struggle that we have. It is a struggle that was there 2,000 years ago. It's a struggle that we have today. The struggle is not about climate change or growth. The struggle is about justice." Ladies and gentlemen, justice is the strife. Thank you very much.
It's a wonderful way to start. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Randall Tolpenrud. I hope I'm saying the name correctly, actually. He's president of the Pax Natura Foundation. He represents the Costa Rican government at the Conference of the Parties, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Land Use Change and Forestry, and Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, REDD protocols. He has a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in environmental studies, both here from the U.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and to the organizers of the conference, especially Professor Dean Chatterjee, for your great leadership in this community and your most kind, gracious invitation. I very much enjoyed that first presentation. Thank you very much. I think it's a good start to what I'm about to share with you. get this set up so I can read it without making a mess here. Yes, it is true. We certainly are a world at war. But I am not referring to wars of religion or Al-Qaeda or Afghanistan or the indiscriminate violence against any individual or culture whose lives and property just happen to have been in the way as a result of the injustices, stupidity, and corporate greed we see all around us. No, the war I refer to is far more insidious, far more dangerous and destructive than any terrorist or rogue nation threat. It is the undeclared war against the natural world that now threatens all life on Earth. We are all aware of the ecological crisis we face, so I will not bother you with all the bad news. Suffice it to say that we seem to be sleepwalking into the 21st century, feigning ignorance to the consequences of our countless acts of violence, both conscious and unconscious, that we wreak upon nature every day. Why are we doing this to ourselves, and what must be done to reverse course? In ancient India, the rishis held that all suffering, both individually and collectively, was the result of pragya prayad, the mistake of the intellect, a mistake promulgated by associating the thinking part of the brain with self-knowledge or enlightenment. To the ancient sages, self-realization would only dawn when the discriminating intellect, replete with ideological agenda and mental content, was transcended to reveal a field of pure consciousness deep within the mind. In essence, the yogi's quest for illumination, or the Socratic ideal of self-knowledge, or the Shakespearean counsel, "Do thine own self be true," would lead to a more enlightened citizens and thus a more enlightened civilization. Analogously, perhaps the environmental crisis we face is a reflection of the fact that we also have forgotten who we are and where we came from. What gives us the right to genetically reconfigure the biosphere of this planet in a generation when nature has been at it for billions of years and does an extraordinarily good job? And why are we ignoring all the warning signs that our control of the climate is now wreaking havoc on the Earth? Does anyone here really believe that human management of the Earth's biomes is a good thing? Remember, our best shot at sustainability, which is just another way the human ego tries to take credit for the equivalent of civilization expressed within and through natural law, lasted only about 2 to 3 years at Biosphere 1 and 2 in the Arizona desert. These man-made ecosystems were designed to explore the complex web of biological interactions necessary to sustain life in an enclosed environment. After these artificial ecosystems collapsed, Dr. Jane Poynter, one of 8 scientists who lived in Biosphere 2 for 2 years, said, basically, the yogis had it right. Humans all need to take a breath and consider what breathing means. I do not believe Dr. Poynter will ever take the simple act of breathing for granted again, and neither should we. Two examples I would like to discuss suggest that we too should take a step back, breathe deep, consider the consequences of our actions, and what steps we must take, we must clearly implement for the benefit of future generations. The biotech industry, now in the throes of unlocking the secrets of DNA and the human genome, now promise panaceas for the production of food, the eradication of disease, and among other exotic possibilities, design our bodies. Think about it. We possess the technology to genetically modify sperm and egg DNA to select desired phenotypic traits that could radically transform the design of the human body. By 2030, you might see people of different colors, including pink, orange, or striped yellow-green, people with fur, people with animated skin, people with various additional body parts added for aesthetic reasons, all to the whims of the latest designer fad. The genetic possibilities are endless, but rarely are the ethical, moral, and environmental concerns subject to any considerable debate. While this emerging technology offers some promise, isn't it a bit terrifying? It is to me. What kind of biological world the human intellect is on the verge of creating by taking control of our own DNA. The process of evolution and natural selection takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to evolve new organisms in response to changing environmental conditions. Natural breeding can only take place between closely related forms of life, that is, cats with cats, not cats with dogs, wheat with wheat, not wheat with tomatoes, fish with fish, and not fish with tomatoes. In this way, the genes that carry information for all parts of the organism are passed down the generations in an orderly way. But the extraordinary claims of the biotech industry are flipping this beautifully orchestrated event on its head. Recombinant DNA gene splicing, or inserting a gene onto a strand of DNA, is, contrary to industry propaganda, not precise, and attaching bacteriological promoters to express specific genes bypasses a holistic set of environmental and genetic factors that nature utilizes to express or to silence DNA. Notwithstanding the moral, religious, and philosophical questions involving the mixing of genetic material across natural barriers that nature has erected over the millennia for good reasons, genetic manipulations could inadvertently mutate normal genes that could disrupt essential cellular or physiological processes. For example, numerous proteins are known to have more than one function. Thus, when genetic engineers alter a gene for the purpose of changing one function of a protein, they may inadvertently interfere with the second function, thereby impairing essential cellular or physiological processes, leading to unforeseen diseases or even cancer. And how do we know that genetically modified organisms, GMOs, that are now in the food we eat on a daily basis are safe when testing these new genetic hybrids are not required? As a matter of fact, GMOs were approved by the Food and Drug Administration against FDA's own staff scientists' recommendations that these organisms not be released into the environment until adequate testing could be performed over extended periods. Unfortunately, those individuals at FDA charged with oversight and approval of GE Foods were part of a revolving door of biotech industry lawyers and corporate heads that were more interested in promoting this new and potentially lucrative technology than ensuring safety through adequate testing. The release of GMOs into the environment constitutes a grave threat to the integrity, balance, and future evolution of life on Earth, and the effects could be irreversible. Disrupting ecosystems in this way could lead to loss of biodiversity, the disruption of soil ecology, including soil fertility, and the increased use of toxic, carcinogenic, and mutagenic agricultural chemicals could lead to a new generation of superweeds, which seems to be happening now, and a wide range of environmental pollutants. Remember, it took us a generation to figure out that nuclear testing in the Nevada desert was killing us. Wouldn't it be wise here to utilize the precautionary principle when charging like a bull into the china shop of nature's microcosm, a field of all possibilities that is clearly interlinked holistically? I believe we are intuitively beginning to understand the challenges here, as evidenced by the growing interest in organic or integrated farming, permaculture, agroecology, biodynamic, agrobiodiversity, et cetera, all pointing to the way in which nature works as an integrated whole. These expressions constitute a declaration of peace with nature by encouraging us to listen and learn to biomimic natural ecosystems, not to arrogantly attempt their total genetic reconfiguration. After all, we are, in fact, incapable of understanding how even a single thought in our own brains rises to consciousness, not to mention the simultaneous coordination of all the other systems of the human body at the same time. It would appear that we are not doing much better managing the Earth's climate. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, composed of roughly 3,500 very conservative climate scientists representing 192 nations, and every credible scientific organization on this planet have now issued the fifth assessment report on global greenhouse gas emissions, and the prognostications are not good. If anything, earlier predictions have underestimated the speed of change we see in evidence throughout the world. We are witnessing perhaps the most monumental transformation of the Earth's biomes in the last 2 millennia, all because we have chosen black or dead carbon instead of blue or green or living carbon to power our needs. As Elizabeth Kolbert wrote in Field Notes from a Catastrophe, it may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself, but that is precisely what we are now in the process of doing. In spite of the growing bitterness and anger directed toward the U.S. for failure to abide by international climate agreements to keep temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, a growing number, which we are going right by that, a growing number of concerned individuals, communities, and nations are now taking matters into their own hands. One particular example stands out. Under the UNFCCC's Kyoto Protocol, a case could be made that the inequities of luxurious versus survival carbon emissions, is addressed under the CDM, or Clean Development Mechanism. Under the mechanism, a provision for the transfer of capital and technology from developed to developing nations was designed to remedy the imbalance and global injustice between emitter and non-emitter nations. The idea behind cap and trade was really quite simple and elegant. In order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the most efficient, rapid, and cost-effective manner possible, given the constraints of current technologies, Annex 1 emissions would be capped with a provision to allow for the trade of credits. Annex 1 or developed nations' emissions would be capped with a provision to allow for the trade of credits in order to meet emissions targets that would give industry time for fuel switching, renewable energy development, carbon capture and storage, etc. Eventually, caps would be reduced to zero as global emissions stabilized to safe levels and the market would go away. Are there problems with the carbon markets? There are many. We don't have time to go into that today. But hasn't it taken decades, after all, to work out some of the kinks on Wall Street and still the evils persist? Setting up a market for a commodity that exists everywhere involving 192 nations is not easy. But there are signs the concept is beginning to work in some areas. Take, for example, California's AB 32 climate change bill, which the whole world is looking at, by the way, for leadership. The first two auctions generated $150 million for, guess what, renewable energy development within the state, and offsets play a crucial role. Whoever said cap and trade was not a tax does not understand cap and trade. Back to our example. Under the Marrakesh Accords of the Kyoto Protocol, specifically land use change, and forestry, or LULUCF, the role of deforestation was recognized as a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 15 to 20%. Yes, destroying the rainforest has upended the climate. Under LULUCF, reforestation and afforestation projects alone would qualify for carbon finance, carbon offset credits, but standing forests would not. The result was a perverse incentive to destroy the world's remaining rainforests and other forests, including the immense biodiversity they contain. Recognizing the significant flaw and political insult to tropical forest nations that LULUCF implied, Costa Rica took steps to insert into the Framework Convention REDD, acronym for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, and REDD++ now, which includes biodiversity conservation, watershed protection, and other features of the forest. Protocols that now appear will be integrated into any new international climate agreement. After decades of deforestation in Costa Rica in the early 20th century, the country implemented the most successful voluntary REDD preservation program ever conceived. This highly successful payment for environmental services program, targeting small to medium-sized landowners and not the wealthy elite, taxes the fossil fuel energy industry and uses the money to pay landowners not to cut their trees. Because PES explicitly recognizes the environmental services that standing forests, that standing trees provide to the country and the world for watershed protection, biodiversity conservation, scenic beauty, and carbon sequestration, it also implicitly recognizes the economic value to human civilization of preserving natural ecosystems. As a result of this program, Costa Rica stopped the destruction of its primary forest, recaptured approximately 26% of its landmass to forest cover in the last 25 years, and has transitioned its economy from non-sustainable agricultural practices to ecotourism. Because of Costa Rican leadership, REDD has come of age and now offers socially conscious individuals, companies, and countries a way to lower their own emissions at a fraction of the cost of other wedges of climate change mitigation. For example, it costs roughly $2 to $5 per metric ton CO2 to lower emissions by protecting tropical rainforests versus $50 to $120 per metric ton CO2 for carbon capture and storage, renewable energy development, fuel switching, etc. Tropical forest PES carbon credits constitute the low-hanging fruit in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and the spirit of the CDM made this possible. I wish to emphasize here that without international agreements on cap and trade, there simply is no other incentive other than goodwill to stop the total destruction of the rainforest. And goodwill, unfortunately, has not been successful. Nothing need be done here to stop the madness of destroying these forests, nature's masterpiece on earth, containing 50% of the planet's biodiversity and home to indigenous peoples and cultures for thousands of years. At Pax Natura, we believe that human rights are predicated upon the rights of all living systems, and until such recognition is institutionalized in human awareness, the survival of species diversity, including the human, will remain in doubt. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not an ideal in the abstract. Fairness as a definition of global justice presupposes environmental sustainability. The rights of future generations to clean air and water, healthy food, and basic shelter, if compromised by the present generation's destruction of these living systems, constitute an infringement and violation of basic human rights. But above and beyond the rights of human beings, the rights of all species, foundational to life itself, must be brought into the debate. The collective congruency and history of public life within the human family is inadequate as a model for any comprehensive theory of global justice. Climate change and mass species extinction demand a reassessment of this notion. The ecological crisis shows that global justice or fairness cannot be limited to political and cultural boundaries between peoples and nations. There are no boundaries in the natural world. This example thus suggests that global environmental justice is the new universal and philosophical moral imperative. Sustainability as a derivative of global environmental justice has little to do with the natural asset base of the planet preserved for future generations. Sustainability is the goal of development expressed within and through natural laws. The system of nature, the universal law of causality. We argue that human conduct in the pursuit of any type of sustainability only becomes possible when derived from the intrinsic rationality of the universe as a whole and not in opposition to it. What is called the Green Development Revolution, which we support, is a manifestation of this principle. Perhaps ecology, renewable energy, green building, non-toxicity, holistic health care, permaculture, organic food, all suggest that we are beginning to remember who we truly are, where we came from, and what we must do to stop the madness. A technological fix to the environmental crisis is not the answer. Rather, by declaring peace with nature and mimicking her systems, we honor the supreme organizing power of natural law, our sovereign on planet Earth. I can think of no better visual to give you than to show you a very quick 1-minute video of one of our, well, actually the chair of our foundation, Dr. Jane Goodall. So if I get this right, let's see, I hit the wrong button, I think. Pardon me? Hit this one? This. There we go. This is a chimp that Thank you very much.
All right, didn't bring my tissues. Okay. We good? Okay. Our final speaker is Professor Kyle White. He's Assistant Professor of Philosophy, Environmental Science and Policy, and American Indian Studies at Michigan State University. He works on ethical issues pertaining to climate change impacts and indigenous peoples. His work, I need my glasses, all that tearing up. Okay, sorry. His work in the area is funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Landscape Conservation Cooperative Program. Please welcome Professor White.
Morning. How's everyone doing? Yeah, decent? Yeah. I have to say one thing. Did most of you guys go to the keynote last night? That's the nicest library I have ever seen in my life, isn't it? Has anyone seen a nicer? Are you one of the funders for the library? Okay, yeah. That's not far from the truth. Now let me just get my slide up. So, yeah, I use this program called Prezi. Some of you might know it. It's a free program. It's really good, I think, for a lot of scientists if you need to make big images and then drill down. As a humanities scholar, I don't do quite as fancy things with it as some of my colleagues do in various areas of environmental policy. Oh, this is the old link. So you guys are going to see me scramble a little bit here. So if you guys promise not to look at my password, I'm going to do things this way. Okay, actually, no, I didn't have to enter it in. You guys wouldn't change my presentations, would you, if you got the password? Okay, allow. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is give you guys an impression of some of the landscape of indigenous issues with climate change. And I'm going to focus on a couple of areas, but as I think you'll see, there are numerous aspects of the presentation that have to do with conflict. And I'll definitely try to touch on those, but I'll also want to focus on some of those issues during the Q&A or during the rest of the day if we're going to have side conversations. Indigenous people, in my opinion, are some of the most active in the world in terms of addressing climate change. And I very much see myself as a professor and as an activist and a tribal member here in the United States as part of that movement. Indigenous peoples take climate change extremely seriously and are incorporating numerous strategies and approaches to climate change adaptation, to mitigation. And one of the things I just wanted to start off with is when I talk about indigenous people, what sorts of groups am I referring to? And the way I understand indigenous people is it refers to about 370 million people worldwide. And it's folks who see themselves as part of communities that were self-determining before some invasion or an earlier form of colonization or an ongoing form of colonization. And now they find their communities living in areas where nations like the US or Canada are considered by everybody else to be the predominant sovereign in those areas. And so indigenous people see themselves as self-determining people. They see themselves as sovereign people, but now they've got this issue that there's this larger group that everybody else seems to recognize as the major sovereign. So whenever you're talking about indigenous people, it's really it's an international movement of groups that are trying to figure out a way to exist as sovereign enclaves in the midst of these larger nations. So issues of self-determination are extremely important when talking about indigenous people. But also one of the things that you hear a lot is that indigenous people see their cultures as distinct from the different cultures of the various nation states that surround them. So indigenous people, like a lot of terms of this kind, is an imprecise term, and there's a lot of counterexamples. But the general way I think of it is that groups for whom self-determination and cultural distinctness are important, they adopt this term as part of their international presence, whereas other groups who might seemingly fit those criteria might not choose to adopt it. Now, with respect to climate change, where does sort of indigenous people's issues and climate change come together? And I wanted to just share with you some of my observations from hanging out with the groups whose logos I have now. So, I read literature from groups like the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I hang out at international meetings, right? There's an Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, which is part of the UNFCCC. There was a First Stewards Symposium, a national conference for Indigenous people addressing climate change. There's a Tribal Climate Change Project. You can see some of my funders listed. So I hang out all the time with Indigenous groups and communities that are working on climate change. And when I go to these events, what I hear are the sorts of things that I listed. These are the things that Indigenous people are concerned about with respect to climate change. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them for reasons of time. But one of the big ones is that a lot of Indigenous people are worried that they're going to have to be relocated and live somewhere else. So if you're familiar with Kivalina or Shishmaref in Alaska, these are communities that have made a decision to relocate. It's expensive. It's costly on their culture, and numerous other issues that all of you can imagine come with something like relocation. Indigenous people are always worried about issues of first foods, of the traditional foods that they rely on. They might lose access to those foods. Those foods might no longer be ones that they can continue to eat because of climate change. And there's even issues like some of you have heard of, that Indigenous subsistence lifestyles actually might be more dangerous to practice. They might become hazardous. But also you hear a lot of impacts that really have to do with the fabric of society. So for example, if climate change makes it so that a culturally significant species moves off reservation or outside of an Indigenous jurisdiction, by the way, all my examples are going to be heavily US based because that's where I work. But if you have a species that moves outside of your Indigenous jurisdiction, and that's the species that you hunted with your grandparents, then maybe it's going to be the case that you're not going to have those relationships with your grandparents anymore. So for Indigenous people, they're worried that climate change is going to make it harder to continue their cultures and their way of life. And there's just numerous issues we can talk about that sort of summarize kind of the problems with some of the examples I described. So Indigenous people are concerned that the jurisdictions that they've relied on, so in the US, for example, treaty rights, reservation boundaries are going to be overwhelmed by climate change. So whereas Indigenous people practice harvesting within reservation or treaty areas, if those species move outside of the treaty area, going to lose access to those species. They're concerned with cultural issues, as I was just talking about. They're also concerned with organizational issues. I mean, most Indigenous people have government entities that do what governments do for any group, and they're worried they don't have the organizational capacity to deal with climate change. For example, a lot of tribes I work with, the same department within that tribe is responsible for every aspect of the environment. And now climate change is coming in and adding to that burden. In addition, climate change is experienced across all tribal departments, so ones about community health, human resources, and so on. And oftentimes those units are already overburdened, and now they have to think about climate change. There's also economic issues. As you can imagine, tribes engage in a number of different kinds of economies, and some of you are familiar with examples of tribes doing things like being, engaged in natural resources extraction or the gaming industry or things like that. But tribes are also engaged just in a number of other economic ventures of all different kinds. So there's not sort of one kind of economy that you see in tribes. But just like with any group of people, folks are worried that climate change is going to undermine these economies or force tribes to make tough decisions about what kind of economic ventures are going to pursue. And then finally, this is a philosophy term, but you find in other fields as well, there's epistemic issues, so issues having to do with knowledge. Like any society, tribes have their own sources of knowledge that they use for guidance to get them through things. Some people call it traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge, and just refers to numerous ways in which societies produce knowledge for their own advancement. And tribes are worried that if the indigenous people are worried that if the landscapes that were part of generating that knowledge, if they're changing, then you also lose the knowledge. When you lose the knowledge, you have to rely on the knowledge of other people, and that creates issues of dependence. So we also have epistemic issues as well. And as you can see, this is an entirely different presentation just talking about these climate change impacts and indigenous people. So in the Great Lakes area where I work, this is sort of a more specific list of climate change impacts that tribes are worried about. And the thing I just wanted to mention here is that, almost for each of these, these aren't just financial issues, right? So with suffering wild rice stands, wild rice is an important food. It's an important part of society for Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes. That's one of the predominant indigenous peoples in the Great Lakes region. If wild rice becomes harder to access, if wild rice goes away, that's a threat to every single aspect of your society. And so what I call this is a collective continuance, and it's not meant to be a fancy word, it's just a word that's meant to express it for tribes. Climate change is all about your ability to continue as a distinct society, as a kind of society that's different from other societies and that has a unique way of life. So about the continuance as a unique collective. And so climate change really goes to the core of indigenous existence. Now, here's what I want to focus on a little bit today. What's the relationship between indigenous people and these nations that I was talking about earlier that now surround them? And this is actually kind of an interesting question because a lot of the social science literature on climate change actually says that it's not really up to nations to create the primary policies for climate change adaptation or mitigation because climate change is spread across a number of different institutions, right? Subnational, NGO, tribes. So that a lot of literature actually suggests that if we see nations as the primary source of climate change policy, that's not good enough. You need more coordinated efforts. And indigenous people are trying to reach out to coordinate with other groups in order to adapt to mitigate climate change. But nonetheless, because historically indigenous people have had ongoing relationships, for good or bad, mostly conflictive with nations, especially in situations where you had severe colonialism and still have that through to today, nations are really going to be one of the primary partners that indigenous people are going to have to work well with if indigenous people are going to adapt to the impacts that I was showing you all earlier in ways that are going to be less harmful. And I want to focus then, too, on this kind of moral idea of responsibility. And I know I've got some true specialists on responsibility here, like Professor Chatterjee, but I'm just going to give a basic definition of how I understand it here for an interdisciplinary audience. So what I understand here, responsibility is that, if I'm vulnerable in some way to a harm, that I have certain expectations of other parties to respond to that vulnerability. And so what you kind of have to show is if nations are responsible to indigenous vulnerability to the climate change impacts I just talked about, then you have to show why it is that nations are responsible for taking some action on behalf of indigenous people, for partnering with indigenous people, for working with indigenous peoples, for climate change adaptation. And I want to talk about a couple of kinds of responsibilities that are commonly discussed. And then I want to present one that's not so commonly discussed, but that I think is key to whether indigenous people and nations are going to be able to partner successfully for adapting to climate change. And it relates to the topic of this conference. So the first thing I want to start out with is what I call an impending responsibility. So nations have an impending responsibility to indigenous people for climate change adaptation, to support them in climate change adaptation. And there's two kinds of impending responsibility I want to discuss. I call it impending responsibility because it's the idea that nations need to gear up to support indigenous people for climate change impacts that are either already happening or that are about to happen. So it's a responsibility that nations are going to have to own up to in the future, even though they might not have been doing it today or historically in the past. And so the first kind is one that we commonly discuss, which is that insofar as many, not all, but many nations endorsed industrialization, endorsed deforestation, and other factors leading to anthropogenic climate change. And then also because indigenous people weren't so into that and didn't really benefit from that. In fact, most indigenous people were harmed quite severely from industrial processes and deforestation. Then it seems to be, right, that indigenous people shouldn't have to suffer climate change impacts alone. That those groups that benefited from it, those groups that endorsed the drivers of climate change, the anthropogenic drivers, they have a responsibility to support indigenous peoples. Now, how are they supposed to do that? Well, the common strategy you see is through I was calling it landscape scale programming, right? But is the idea of providing indigenous people with the financial support and the technical resources to be able to figure out how to adapt on their own. Now, how well are nations doing that today? Well, if you ask most people, like in the United States, there are definitely programs like the Landscape Conservation Cooperative or the Bureau of Indian Affairs Climate Adaptation Fund that seek to engage indigenous people on climate change and to provide technical resources and to provide sort of support at the landscape scale. But there's just not very much funding. So there's a well-known statistic that shows that of the climate change adaptation funds distributed across the U.S. Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs just gets a fraction. And even this year, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was only about $600,000 or $700,000 in climate change adaptation funds from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for Tribes, and that's to be divided among 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and that's not even all the indigenous people here, because there are state-recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes as well. Not a very big pot of money, and even with the landscape conservation cooperatives or climate science centers, their indigenous programs, tribal programs, are just really a tiny fraction of what they're doing. So while I think you see different groups having kind of the right idea about how to provide this support, there's not enough of it. So I think we need to keep asserting that this is one important kind of responsibility. A second one, which is a little bit different, that fits kind of in this impending responsibility, has to do with this idea that, climate change is a cross-boundary issue. Climate change doesn't care about the state of Michigan or the state of Wisconsin borders or the county borders, right? And one of the things is that a lot of tribes, right, like Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes, they existed across what is now called Canada and the U.S. And these sort of borders were not drawn up with tribal consent, and in the early 20th century, indigenous people were not allowed to participate as sovereigns in the emerging international community. So if you have a climate change impact that affects Anishinaabe people and they need to have jurisdiction across the US and Canada, they're prevented to do that by doing that, right, because of that border. And so this responsibility is the idea that indigenous peoples, because they weren't allowed to participate in the international system, and because climate change precisely challenges that system, that some of these emerging indigenous rights policies, like the UN Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People, should actually be used more prominently as the governance instruments for justifying indigenous peoples crossing these different jurisdictions to handle climate change issues, right? So that an Anishinaabe group could use the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to justify joint action across the US and Canadian border. So it's this idea that nations have a responsibility to honor these new indigenous norms and protocols that are emerging. And how well is that working? Well, in some cases you see UNDRIP very prominent, like for example a lot of countries that are pursuing REDD policies actively, like in the previous presentation. They mentioned UNDRIP, UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, quite a bit. Whereas in the United States, we don't see that as much. The U.S. has recognized or supports the declaration. So these are impending responsibilities because they're things that nations are going to have to own up to, at least some nations that are implicated in climate change in the way I described. What people don't actually talk about is what I call pending responsibility. And this actually has to do with the idea that climate change isn't actually a new issue for indigenous people. If you look at climate change more broadly as human societies responding to sort of broad changes in climate and so on, well, indigenous people have been dealing through this for years. In fact, it's countries like the United States through colonization that have inflicted different kinds of climate change on indigenous people in their colonial activities, right? So if you look, for example, at a couple of examples that I wanted to just mention. So how have they done this, right? Well, when the United States engaged in deforestation, when it engaged in other forms of habitat destruction and so on, that changed the climate, and indigenous people had to adjust to that. Now, they might not have known they were doing this before. So when you look at things like this that show how wild rice has declined because of mining, well, it's not just because of mining that wild rice in the Great Lakes has declined. It's because of all sorts of landscape scale changes that colonization brought, extinctions, deforestation, and so on. And that was part of colonialism. Another thing is pollution. With respect to pollution, this is the areas of concern from EPA for the Great Lakes region. This has affected fishing and all sorts of other traditional and ceremonial practices that Anishinaabe and other groups live with all of these areas of concern. And this goes way back to industrial processes, and indigenous people have been adjusting to pollution, for now hundreds of years. And finally, relocation is not a new thing. It's not just something that occurs now in Alaska. It's something that's occurred historically, right? So this is the Anishinaabe group now. These are all distinct Anishinaabe groups. They all used to be sort of one group with some exceptions. Don't quote me on that. But why is there one in Oklahoma, even though there's supposed to be one in the Great Lakes, right? That's actually my tribe. I'm enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. That was a form of climate change too, forced removal from the Great Lakes to Oklahoma, completely different. So one of the things that we find actually is that when climate change just reasserts the idea that nations have always inflicted climate change on indigenous people through colonialism, and never have they actually come up with adequate political relations for assisting indigenous people to deal with those climate changes, right? Whether it's the liquidation of tribal reservations in the 1880s, or whether it's the Indian Reconstruction policy, or the current policy, or the treaty era, none of these political relations between nations and indigenous people were adequate for supporting indigenous adaptation in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And if you look in detail, you'll find that a lot of the kinds of responsibilities I was talking about first, the impending responsibilities, those will not be executed well or implemented well until those political relations are reformed. So, for example, the landscape conservation cooperatives or climate science centers oftentimes stumble in their relations with indigenous people because they're working with these sort of outdated kinds of political relationships. So what I want to suggest actually is that climate change invokes a further responsibility of nations to indigenous peoples, which is to engage in a form of political reconciliation where they come to terms with the fact that climate change is inherently a part of colonialism, and that there needs to be a redesign in those political relationships if indigenous people are going to adapt successfully. I'm done.
Do we have any questions? And if you want to direct a question to a particular speaker, just go ahead and say so, or for the whole panel. Yes, please.
Thank you all for coming today. It was a great talk and wonderful panel. In our class, we've been discussing some of these social equity issues, and in particular looking at the international climate change regime. So clearly it's the OECD countries by and large have been responsible for emissions over the past 150 years. I don't think anyone would deny that, but looking forward in the next 10 years, we expect many of the emerging market economies to begin being the biggest emitters in the world. How do we justify this dilemma? How do we sort of, from a social equity perspective, how do we solve this? I'd love to hear each one of you's thoughts on this dilemma.
Do you want to jump in first?
Well, it's working. I'm not sure if it is or not.
Yes, when you're close to it, it does.
I really think that the climate change agreements that have been in process now for decades really provides a framework for really trying to deal with this subject, with this issue, moving forward. Yes, we all know who the culprit is. We know it was the United States primarily and Europe. But now that's not the case anymore. China's now the principal emitter. They're going to have to be part of the process. They're going to have to be part of the solution, along with all the other Annex II nations are going to have to be part of the process. The idea behind that original agreement was that it would allow for the transfer of technology and capital to allow for the clean development of these nations so that they could not, and they could develop their economies, which they have a right to do. They could develop their economies in a clean way that didn't replicate our models. And that was the idea of this, to give them the resources to make that happen. It hasn't come about primarily because of 6 Republican United States senators. The Waxman-Markey bill was in place in the United States, and we couldn't get it past the Senate. So we came that close, and I think that would have been an impetus for moving forward with regard to replacing Kyoto. It hasn't come about, but when you think about trying to come up with an agreement regulating a pollutant that exists everywhere involving 192 nations, it's an extremely challenging thing. We have to deal with adaptation measures. We have to deal with economic development. We cannot rob countries of the opportunity to cut their forests, utilize their natural resources just because we want to continue to do what we want to do. So working to balance those inequities has been an extremely challenging thing, but I really think that the Kyoto Protocol went a long way to providing a framework for that. We have to continue working in that regard.
I can say something too, or did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I want to just answer that question in another way as well, because for a lot of indigenous people, there isn't a lot of hope that nations, like you mentioned, will fulfill like any of the responsibilities I described, and given that what they would require, especially the pending responsibility nations have always had to indigenous people. I think in a lot of contexts people aren't that hopeful, right? But a whole other area, which I do think is a serious area of solution, is that indigenous peoples all over the place are reaching out to different sorts of partners. So a lot of times indigenous people were sort of wedded to nation states because of either the treaty system or other sort of problematic relationships. But now a lot of indigenous people are realizing, wait a minute, we don't have to be tied to these guys anymore. In fact, it's probably not most effective to even work with them, right? They're big, they're slow, they don't understand indigenous cultures. Instead, they should try to work with municipalities, with NGOs, and there's obviously a long-standing relationship with many indigenous groups and NGOs, but it's expanding. And indigenous people are exploring sort of other kinds of models of adaptation and mitigation as well. So I think you see a lot of people try to also sort of take matters in their own hands and engage in different forms of governance. Because there's just not a lot of hope that some of the parties that you mentioned are really going to do things. That's not to say that they're not, but if you're like an indigenous community, you've been through hell, right, with the nation states over the years, then there's no reason to trust that they would.
Yeah. There's a wonderful article which I would encourage very much. It's available on the web. It's called Greenhouse Development Rights. By Paul Bear, Tom Athanasio, Shivan Kartha. Sort of the idea behind your question was very much on the minds of people in 1992, and they coined a phrase which helped bring the countries together. That's common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That means addressing climate change is a common responsibility of all humankind, but it is also a differentiated responsibility because different people have different sort of components of that responsibility. Number two, that there are different capabilities in this. One way in which I can encourage you to think is that, just let us for the moment forget about the national boundaries and ask who is contributing in what measure. Now, we know that in this country we use roughly 250 kilowatt hours per person per day on average of total energy. Europe and Japan, with the same standard of living, uses about 120. China uses about 50. Africa, 10. South Asia, 20. And this also gives you a correlation when you look at their. This is on a per capita basis. Now, when you put 1.2 billion people together, even if they're using 20 or 50, it adds up. And so you say, well, China is 28% of the world's emissions, which it is, but it's also 25% of the world's population in some sense, So one of the things that we have constantly talked about is this difference between per capita and global, the aggregate emissions. So the equity issues really come down to, on the one side, who is contributing what on a per capita basis, right? Nations are important because they can organize collective actions. So we want China to do more than what would be indicated by its responsibility because it's an organized country with 1.3 billion people, right? And if the same people were diffused, we probably would have wanted them to do less. The Greenhouse Development Rights paper that I mentioned is an attempt to kind of work through all of these principles and come up with certain formulas. One way in which they do it is, for instance, to use something that hopefully Francis will talk about later. They say, the sort of equitable or kind of an income level which guarantees a minimum level of human development is about $10,000 per capita. Okay. Some countries have 500, some countries have 1,000, some countries have 5,000, 10,000. Here we have about 50,000. Now they say 10,000. So they say, look, if what we could do is everywhere around the world, we have a progressive tax above the income of $10,000. So anybody with more than $10,000, regardless of whether they're in China or India or Malawi, pay a tax to help solve the climate problem. You see what I mean? Now, when you do that, you will find that a lot of the developing countries' money will stay there, but a lot of the surplus from developed countries will flow to the country. The question really is, what I was trying to come at, is that the problem is not climate. We know what to do. The problem is social justice. And the problem is finding something on which we can all agree and say, look, here is what we need to do. And this is something we've been struggling for 25 years, and we haven't found it. And that is really the point that you raised, is really the stumbling block.
Great. Do you want to add to that?
Just another quick note with regard to that. With regard to the carbon markets, the regulatory market is a mess. The EU ETS is replete with problems. And with regard to forestry, as I mentioned in my talk, that standing forests were left out of the equation. So as a result of that, nations got together and organized. 33 nations got together at the COP 14, 15, and 16, and 17 conferences, and basically they just became rebels with a cause. And they organized the voluntary market, and they started setting standards for the idea of trading in those credits to allow for that to happen. And they have been this major source of innovation, creativity, and they've implemented projects worldwide, a number of projects worldwide, especially RED projects worldwide, very large projects worldwide, where they have achieved a substantial amount of funding by going outside of the box and taking it on themselves. So it's an example where I think there is this growing momentum building in the world that, okay, we're not going to wait forever for international agreements to come down. We're going to take responsibility on our own hands. Cities, counties, states, there's now jurisdictional nested RED on RED carbon emissions, but cities and states in the United States are taking the matter into their own hands. Mayor Rocky Anderson here in the state of Utah implemented methane capture out at the Utah landfill, implemented energy-saving features throughout the city. He took leadership role in setting up the joint cooperation of a number of cities throughout the United States. You see more and more and more of that all the time, this voluntary effort taking place. And I really think people really miss the power of renewable energy in this regard, to move away from old models of point source pollution and major utility companies providing power when people can take that responsibility for themselves. I drive an electric car. My electric car is powered by the solar panels on my roof. I don't pay anybody for that power. It's free. And that's an enormously empowering experience for anyone. I'm sorry, going on too long. Okay. Wanted to add that to it.
Did we have another question right here?
Yes, this is a question for Terry. Thanks very much for your presentation. So you suggested that we needed to try and move to a position that is beyond the creed of growth, and I want to speak up a little bit for growth. So you said that growth hides a multiple of sins, but in fact, the situation is, I would say, a little bit different to that, in that the advent of economic growth, which, as you rightly point out, came from the exploitation of these kinds of fossil fuels, these new energy sources, didn't more than hide sins. It enabled us to really realize certain kinds of social goods and justice in a way that we never could before. And this was brought home to me very powerfully by an argument that I first heard presented by Martin Wolf, the economist. I think it preceded him. So he draws a graph of growth through human history.
Question.
Sure. And what you see is it's basically flat until the Industrial Revolution, at which point it starts to rise. And what's significant about that is for the first time in human history, you have a non-zero-sum game, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, the only way that a society could enrich itself was essentially by raiding, by stealing goods from other societies. After the Industrial Revolution, that's no longer the case. And so we can see the development of more kinds of cooperative forms of national, international agency. Now, if that stops, if we go back to a pre-growth world that we had before the Industrial Revolution, we have to face all of the issues that come with that zero-sum world. And we have a hard enough time doing that in a growth world. How do we even think about doing that, reverting to a zero-sum, non-growth world?
Thank you, David. How much time do we have?
Well, yeah.
No, this is really the fundamental issue. I absolutely agree, David, with what you said about that growth is something that enabled us, with a lag, about 150 years, to realize that we don't have to kill each other anymore. Okay? Remember that for the first 100 years, that was not the case. I mean, we went on a rampage that the world had never before seen. Yeats's The Second Coming, about this, this what strange beast with the head of a human and the body of a lion. I mean, energy gave us the body of a lion, and then it was with that pitiless gaze of the humans that we started moving, and we really just started destroying things. By the middle of the century, after we had killed several hundred people, we thought, oh my God, we don't have to fight each other anymore. The problem is, by that time the bonanza was gone, right? I mean, it took us 150 years to figure it out. Now, some people actually see that as far as the rich countries are concerned, growth is no longer necessary because it doesn't do anything to our welfare. And we need to find a way to go beyond it. Japan, for the last 20 years, has had zero growth, and it is still a decent human society. And there are questions about whether it can be done. There is still a question about how to bring developing countries to the point where they don't need growth anymore. And so in some sense, you can say it's like an Indiana Jones movie. We are trying to get under the door before the door closes. Can we do it? We don't know. That's number one. The second issue is, what happens when we do actually come back to the zero-sum world? Do we go back to our bad old days and start killing each other, or can we actually find a real basis for cooperation? Now, I am an optimist. I think if we can give human beings the chance to get to some kind of a decent level, they will, my children and my grandchildren, they will be mature enough to try to find a way of living which on the basis of which they can cooperate. And other non-material sources of growth can hopefully still continue. We don't know, but right now we are at a point where we need to buy some time, maybe 60 years, maybe 50 years, for this transition to become possible. The challenge will be there, and human society will need to come to grips with it. I don't think we are ready to do it now. And climate change, in some sense, has come too soon. But I do think that at some point in time, we have to face it or go back to our wonderful ways in which killing is the greatest glory that a human being can achieve. I really think that those are the two options. So I'm in agreement with you, but I do think that in the end, that is a problem that we have to solve, and in the middle, we have to get to the point where we can solve that problem.
Should we take another question? Okay, I'm going to go to the back, to the way back, to be fair.
My question specifically addresses what Dr. Ponnuri said about social justice, but I suppose it could be answered by any of the panelists. I would beg to differ with the gentleman who spoke just now. I still think that the countries of the global north are robbing countries of the global south blind. A lot of the political texts I've read recently have argued that sustainable development is but a thinly veiled attempt by countries of the global north to advance the project of transnational neoliberal capitalism to the detriment of the global south. I suppose my question then is an overall paradigm shift required away from sustainable development as a dominant ideology to achieve social justice on a global scale?
You've almost answered your own question in a way. I agree with you completely that the idea of sustainable development veils the fact that we just simply going to remove all barriers to massive natural resource consumption and exploitation, or are we really going to do something that brings us back into balance with this planet we're living on? And sustainable development has a lot of negative connotations, but I think that I would like to just refer back to the idea of sustainable development that I have, the perspective that I have. It is simply a completely different model that we have. It is energy that is produced directly from sunlight or indirectly from sunlight in the form of wind or solar. It is pharmacology that takes advantage of natural healing systems within the human physiology. We stop the pollution. We stop the destruction of our air and our water. And it's amazing how much less we will spend on healthcare costs across the board. So clean development is the model that we have to export, not the old traditional development models that have resulted in a calamity and a disaster that now the Department of Defense says is a major national security threat. So anyway, a thought.
You know, I feel that I wish I was on the other side of the room because partly you're younger than me, and it's a younger person who says these kind of things, and partly it is also that these things need to be said. Let me just make 2 points. One is, there's the old saying about, somebody asked an Irishman how to get to the post office, and he said, well, for one thing, I won't start from here. The issue is that, there are places that we want to go, and this is not the best place to start. Unfortunately, this is the place we need to start from. And we cannot wish away everything that exists upon the earth, just because we want to get somewhere. I mean, to give you an example, I know that we need to get to a point where population growth is 0, not even epsilon. It has to be 0, because unless it is 0, we will destroy the earth. But we have to start from where we are with the population, with the demographic momentum, and we have to continue to work with that. Now, sustainable development is precisely such an idea. We do need to get to the point where we are in balance with nature. We want to know what is the first step to take. I agree with Randall that one of the first steps has to be about energy, and converting from the climate-causing energy to other forms of energy are a problem. Some of my friends argue that the only way to do it is by destroying the corporation. And, in my weaker moments, I think that, yes, that is correct. But I do believe that at this moment, if a corporation can help us begin to move in that direction, I'm very happy with that. It's not something that, I don't want this ideal to come into the way of where we want to go. And sustainable development does enable us to take the necessary steps at this time to begin to move in this direction. In the long term, I hope that whatever you just said is something that does get realized by the human race. I think it is necessary for it to be realized, but not now. As who was it? St. Augustine, I believe, who said that God give me virtue, but not yet.
I just wanted to say quickly, you should send me an email. I'm easy to find online, because a lot of different indigenous groups and conferences and so on have provided different conceptions of sustainability and different diagnoses of the problem and so on. And we oftentimes don't talk about those enough. I mean, there's just tons of declarations out there that are meaningful, and that they're different from the conception that you mentioned. So send me an email, and I'll send you every one that I know of.
Should we go to break? Okay. So hopefully we're about to go for a break, and there's some lovely, yummy things to have over there to drink and eat. And hopefully the 3 panelists will be willing to stay up here and answer questions personally, one-on-one. So please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much.